In the last 72 hours, intelligence analysts across Europe have confirmed something absolutely unprecedented on the modern battlefield. Russia has been completely forced to abandon its core military doctrine. The mechanized assaults that were supposed to steamroll through Ukraine's defenses have simply stopped happening. And the reason is staggering. Ukraine has destroyed Russia's entire tank force in multiple sectors. This isn't speculation from analysts. This is verified military reality that fundamentally changes how we understand this conflict. I'm Sophie Hart, and you're watching Sophie Hart Reports. If you want to stay ahead of the most critical geopolitical developments in real time, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now. For more than 9 months, Russia has been throwing everything it has at the city of Vovchansk. 9 months of constant assault, tens of thousands of soldiers sent into the meat grinder, artillery barrages that have reduced the city to ruins, drone strikes, tactical air support. Everything Russia could mobilize has been directed at this one border town in northeastern Ukraine. And yet, despite all of this overwhelming force, Russia controls almost nothing that it didn't already control before. Why? Because the tanks that were supposed to lead these offensives are gone. All of them. The armor that Russia was counting on to break through Ukrainian defenses has been systematically obliterated by drones and anti-tank fire. Russia has been forced to send soldiers into Vovchansk on foot, and those soldiers are dying by the hundreds. This is the story of how Putin's military doctrine collapsed. On May 10th, 2024, Russia surprised everyone, including its own supposed allies, by launching a massive ground offensive out of Belgorod directly into Ukraine's Kharkiv region. This wasn't a small probing attack. Ukrainian intelligence had detected the buildup for weeks. But when it came, the scale was shocking. Thousands of Russian troops, supported by what was supposed to be overwhelming armored force, punched across the border toward the city of Vovchansk. The plan was simple on paper. Use mechanized assaults, tank formations, and armored personnel carriers to push through Ukrainian defenses. Establish a buffer zone along the border, possibly even encircle and threaten Kharkiv itself. Initial Russian tactical assessments promised they could take Vovchansk in just 2 days. Ukrainian military commanders immediately recognized the threat. They rushed reinforcements to the city. The veteran 82nd Airborne Brigade, the 71st Mountain Brigade, and battle-hardened 36th Marine Brigade arrived within days to bolster defenses. Despite the shock of the initial assault and the sheer volume of Russian firepower, Ukrainian forces held. They stabilized the situation by late May. Within just 3 weeks of the offensive beginning, Ukraine's top general, Alexander Syrsky, was already telling the world that Russian forces were completely bogged down. They had failed to achieve anything close to their objectives. What was supposed to be a swift mechanized breakthrough had turned into a grinding street battle, where Russia was losing enormous numbers of soldiers for tiny tactical gains. The question everyone started asking was why? Why couldn't Russia, with its numerical advantage and heavy equipment, make progress? The answer was devastating for Putin's military. By mid-2025, according to open-source intelligence and NATO assessments, Russia had lost over 4,300 tanks and more than 8,700 armored personnel carriers across the entire war. Some estimates put the true number significantly higher. But what matters for understanding Vovchansk is what happened to Russian armor specifically in the Kharkiv sector. By the time Russia realized its large-scale mechanized assault strategy wasn't working, Ukraine had already destroyed enough Russian tanks and armored vehicles to make any further large-unit assaults suicidal. Ukrainian drones, primarily FPV drones costing less than $500 to produce, were proving more effective than armor that cost millions. In the summer of 2024, Russian military analysts made a damning assessment. Their tank losses had become so catastrophic that continuing to throw heavy armor at Ukrainian positions made no tactical sense anymore. The armor would just be destroyed. So Russia made a strategic shift. Instead of sending tanks forward, instead of sending armored personnel carriers to transport troops, instead of even sending military trucks, Russia started sending infantry soldiers on foot, walking across open ground, walking across fields, walking without any protection whatsoever. This was the only way Russia could move troops forward without losing millions of dollars worth of equipment to Ukrainian drone strikes. It was a tactical admission of defeat. The proud Russian mechanized army had become a walking army. The last time Russia attempted a significant mechanized assault in Vovchansk was in the summer of 2024. That was more than 7 months ago. According to Ruslana Bughan, the communications officer of Ukraine's 57th Separate Motorized Infantry Brigade, mechanized assaults became impossible after summer 2024, in the Vovchansk sector specifically. Bughan told Ukraine's Army TV that tanks just couldn't be used effectively anymore. She said drones stop them all. Using vehicles is ineffective. BTRs don't work for moving infantry. Tanks don't work. Regular cars don't work. The only thing that works is sending men on foot and hoping they don't get spotted by drones before they can establish a position. This represented one of the most significant tactical shifts in modern warfare. Russia, a military that had historically built its power around armored formations and tank-heavy doctrine, was now reduced to sending dismounted infantry without any armor support whatsoever. The men would walk, the drones would find them, and most of them would be killed. This dynamic played out hundreds of times in Vovchansk between summer 2024 and February 2026. Russian soldiers would attempt to infiltrate Ukrainian positions in small groups of 3 to 5 men. They would try to move quietly across no man's land. They would attempt to slip around Ukrainian defenses. And almost every time, Ukrainian reconnaissance drones would spot them. And then the FPV drones would be called in. Specialized drone operators would send their unmanned aircraft directly at the Russian soldiers. The drones would strike. The Russians would be eliminated. Then the entire process would repeat. By fall 2024, Russia had completely restructured its tactical approach in the Kharkiv region. Instead of company-sized assaults with armor support, Russia was now sending infiltration teams of 3 to 5 soldiers. These teams would be equipped with their own drone operators, positioned behind the lines, trying to guide them toward gaps in Ukrainian defenses. If they found a gap, they would try to slip through and establish a foothold. The plan was to hold that foothold until reinforcements arrived. In theory, these small units could avoid detection where large armored formations could not. In practice, Ukraine's drone operations were so effective that these small teams were being detected and destroyed almost as quickly as Russia could send them. Ukrainian soldiers interviewed about these tactics described a grim but effective counter-strategy. When small Russian infiltration groups were spotted by reconnaissance drones, Ukrainian forces would concentrate fire on them. The Russian soldiers would try to hide in buildings. They would attempt to camouflage themselves. Sometimes they would dig in and try to hold a position. But Ukraine's drones would stay overhead. The FPV drones would make surgical strikes. The Russians would take enormous casualties. And by February 2026, Russia was still continuing this exact same strategy despite its obvious failure. On February 2nd alone, according to Ukrainian military reports, Russia launched 11 separate assaults in the Vovchansk sector. 11 different attacks by small infantry groups attempting to move forward. Almost all of them failed. Most of the soldiers involved were killed or wounded. Viktor Tregubov, the spokesman for Ukraine's Joint Forces Task Force in charge of the Vovchansk sector, explained in early February that Russian troops were still attempting to bypass and infiltrate the city despite its complete destruction. The situation remained frankly difficult. Russians were pressing on Ukrainian positions on the outskirts of Vovchansk. The entire city was destroyed. There was no infrastructure left to serve as a physical barrier to Russian movement. Yet despite all of that, despite being surrounded by ruins that offered them no protection whatsoever, Russian soldiers continued to attempt assaults. Tregerbov noted that while the Russians were making limited advances in the gray zone, the so-called disputed territory between the two armies, every foot of ground gained came at the cost of enormous Russian casualties. This is the fundamental dynamic that has defined Vovchansk from May 2024 to February 2026. Russia makes extremely small advances. These advances are measured in hundreds of meters, but each advance costs Russia dozens of soldiers. Over 600 days of constant assault, Russia had lost more than 15,000 soldiers in the Vovchansk sector alone. That's approximately 25 soldiers per day, every single day, for more than a year and a half. In some months, the losses were even higher. In August 2024, Ukrainian forces reported killing or wounding nearly 1,200 Russian soldiers near Vovchansk. Russia was essentially running a grinding war of attrition where it was losing the attrition. Russia had more soldiers available to send, but Ukraine had better defenses and better drone technology. Russia's strategy was mathematically unsustainable. The weapon that broke Russia's mechanized assault strategy was the FPV drone. These are small, remotely piloted aircraft. They cost between $350 and $500 to build from commercial components. They can carry explosives. They can be flown directly at targets, and they have proven devastatingly effective against tanks, armored vehicles, and now infantry groups. According to a NATO official speaking to Foreign Policy in 2024, more than two-thirds of Russian tank losses in recent months had been inflicted by Ukrainian FPV drones. That number has only increased. By 2025, some military analysts were estimating that nearly 65 to 67% of all Russian armor destroyed was being destroyed by these inexpensive drones. By early 2025, Ukraine was producing approximately 200,000 FPV drones per month. This represents a dramatic scaling up from earlier in the war. Ukraine had started producing thousands per month, then tens of thousands, and by 2025 was approaching 250,000 per month. Each drone costs less than $500 to produce. Each can destroy a tank worth millions. The economics are absolutely lopsided in Ukraine's favor. Russia couldn't possibly buy drones at the same rate Ukraine was producing them. Russia's response was to attempt to develop countermeasures, cope cages, netting, electronic jamming, but none of it was particularly effective. The drones just adapted. Ukraine began using fiber optic controlled drones that couldn't be jammed electronically. Ukraine developed better targeting systems. Ukraine improved training for drone operators. And Russia's armor losses accelerated. The natural question is why Russia continues to assault Vovchansk when it's clear the strategy isn't working. The answer lies in strategic geography and Putin's broader war objectives. Vovchansk sits about 5 kilometers from the Russian border. It's in Kharkiv Oblast, far from the main Russian objective in Donetsk. Russia's real territorial goal is to conquer the Donbas region, specifically Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. So why spend so much blood and treasure on Vovchansk? Part of the answer is that Vovchansk sits on a rail line that connects Belgorod to Kupiansk. Controlling this rail line would give Russia better supply logistics, but that's not the primary reason. The primary reason is that Russia is terrified of another Ukrainian counter-invasion like the Kursk offensive. In August 2024, just 3 months after the Vovchansk offensive began, Ukraine launched a surprise offensive into Russia's Kharkiv Oblast. Ukrainian forces captured about 1,300 square kilometers of Russian territory. They established positions inside Russia itself. This was a massive humiliation for Putin. It showed the Russian leader could not protect his own territory. It took Russia months and tens of thousands of soldiers to push Ukrainian forces back out. Ukraine eventually withdrew from most of Kursk territory, but the message was clear. Ukraine could invade Russia whenever it wanted. Russia could not stop a determined Ukrainian offensive. So Putin became obsessed with the idea of creating a buffer zone, a strip of captured Ukrainian territory that would push Ukrainian artillery and potential invasion forces far enough from the border to reduce the threat. Vovchansk, being right on the border, is critical to this buffer zone strategy. Russia has destroyed approximately 90% of Vovchansk's housing in an attempt to eliminate it as a launching point for potential Ukrainian counteroffensives. Ukrainian Major Taras Berezovets explained that Russia had reduced the city to uninhabitable rubble, specifically to prevent it from being used as a base for incursions into Russian territory. This is why Russia continues to attack, even though the attacks are failing. Russia must capture or destroy Vovchansk to secure what Putin considers the buffer zone, and Ukraine must defend Vovchansk to prevent Russia from establishing that strategic depth. One factor that temporarily aided Russian infiltration tactics was the winter weather. In January and early February 2025, the Volcha River, which flows through Vovchansk, froze over. The frozen river, which had previously served as a significant obstacle to Russian movement, became a highway for infiltration. Russian soldiers could cross the frozen water and attempt to establish positions on the other side. Viktor Tregubov noted that during this winter window, Russia took full advantage of the temporary advantage the frozen rivers provided. They launched dozens of infiltration attempts. They succeeded in moving some soldiers into areas they hadn't occupied before. But this winter window is temporary. By early February, water temperatures were rising. The ice would soon break up. Rivers would return to flowing status, and the natural barrier that had protected Ukrainian positions would return. Tregubov specifically noted that Russian use of the frozen rivers was not something Ukraine needed to be concerned about long-term. The tactical window was closing. Winter had briefly favored Russia, but spring would favor Ukraine. By February 4th, 2026, the current date of this report, winter was finally releasing its grip on the eastern Kharkiv region. The frozen rivers were thawing. Russian infiltration attempts over the Volcha River would become far more difficult, and Ukrainian forces could once again count on natural defenses to help protect their positions. The human cost of Russia's strategy in Vovchansk is staggering. Over 600 days of assault, from May 2024 to February 2026, Russia had suffered approximately 15,000 casualties. That's not killed. That's killed, wounded, and missing combined. The death toll alone is estimated at more than 6,000 soldiers. This doesn't account for soldiers who deserted, soldiers who refused to fight, or soldiers whose units were completely destroyed and reformed. The math is relentless. 25 Russian soldiers per day, on average, lost in the Vovchansk sector. In peak months like August 2024, that number approached 40 soldiers per day, sometimes 50. These are soldiers who were sent to take a city that was already in ruins against an enemy with superior drone technology, without armor support, and with minimal hope of success. Ukrainian commanders describe the dynamic with dark precision. Yes, Russia was making advances. Yes, small amounts of territory were changing hands. But the cost was absolutely catastrophic. Ukrainian soldier Artem, a former deputy commander in Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade, described the pattern. Russian soldiers would attempt to establish hidden positions using tents and natural cover. They would move through no man's land only in directions their commanders designated. They would hope to find gaps in Ukrainian defenses, and almost invariably, they would be discovered by Ukrainian drones. By some estimates, up to 90% of Russian infiltration attempts in Vovchansk resulted in the Russian soldiers being killed or captured. The success rate for Russia's strategy was approximately 10%. Russia's pivot away from armor-dependent tactics in Vovchansk is having broader implications for Russian military strategy across the entire war. Russian military analysts have begun openly advocating for a complete doctrinal overhaul. Some Russian defense experts have suggested that Russia must abandon the idea that tanks form the backbone of warfare. Russia must catch up to Ukraine in unmanned systems. Russia must transition to drone-centric warfare. These are stunning admissions from Russian analysts. They represent an acknowledgement that traditional Russian military doctrine has been rendered obsolete by Ukrainian innovation. The numbers tell the story. During the initial stages of Russia's invasion in 2022, Russian armored vehicle losses outnumbered Ukrainian losses by a factor of 4-1. By the time Russia captured Avdiivka in late 2023, that ratio had improved slightly to 5-1. But by May 2025, the ratio had dropped to 2-1. Russia was losing armor, but not at the catastrophic rates of earlier. Why? Because Russia was using less armor. Russia had finally accepted that tanks and armored vehicles were liabilities in modern warfare against an enemy with drone dominance. Russia was preserving what armor it had left and using infantry on foot instead. This preserved equipment, but cost lives. The evolution of drone technology during the Vovchansk battle has been remarkable. Early in the war, Ukraine relied primarily on modified commercial drones, particularly DJI Mavics and other quadcopters. These drones served reconnaissance and light strike roles. As the war progressed, Ukraine developed specialized FPV drones. These purpose-built aircraft carried heavier payloads. They had better control characteristics. They could be flown more aggressively at targets. By 2025, Ukraine had developed fiber-optic controlled drones that were immune to Russian electronic jamming. Ukraine had also created loitering munitions that can search for targets over wide areas before striking. Russian forces attempted to develop countermeasures. Cope cages, essentially metal frameworks welded to the tops of tanks, offered some protection against dropped munitions. Electronic jamming systems were deployed to disrupt drone control signals. Anti-drone net systems were employed. Net-firing guns attempted to bring down drones in mid-flight. But all of these countermeasures were only partially effective. They slowed Ukrainian drone operations, but did not stop them. For every countermeasure Russia deployed, Ukraine developed a countermeasure. The arms race between drones and drone defenses continues to this day. But Ukraine has maintained a decisive advantage. Ukraine's drone operators are more skilled, more numerous, and better motivated than Russian drone operators. Vovchansk has become the manifestation of the broader stalemate in the Russo-Ukrainian war. Neither side can achieve a decisive breakthrough. Russia cannot capture the city because its mechanized assault doctrine has failed, and its infantry has insufficient density to overrun Ukrainian defenses. Ukraine cannot push Russia out of the northern outskirts of Vovchansk because defending the city requires committing soldiers that could potentially be used on other fronts. So the war has settled into a grinding attrition, where both sides pay enormous costs for minimal territorial changes. Russia loses more soldiers because it's attacking. Ukraine loses soldiers because it's defending. The mathematics favor Ukraine in the long term, because Russia is running out of soldiers while Ukraine has more external support. By February 2026, Ukraine still controlled the southern and eastern sections of Vovchansk. Russia occupied the ruins of the northern industrial sector. Small infiltration teams continued to attempt to slip into Ukrainian-held areas. Occasionally, they succeeded in establishing footholds in buildings. Occasionally, they were immediately counterattacked and eliminated. The front line in Vovchansk is not a line, but a series of contested buildings in a city that has been 90% destroyed. This is not the mechanized warfare that military academies study. This is not the armored breakthrough doctrine that Russia trained its officers to execute. This is the total degradation of Russia's military strategy, forced upon them by the dominance of Ukrainian drone technology. The situation in Vovchansk is not unique. It's representative of Russia's tactical failures across the entire front. In other sectors, Russia is attempting the same infantry-only assaults. In other sectors, Russia is preserving armor that's suffering casualty rates it cannot replace. In other sectors, Ukraine's drones are inflicting catastrophic losses. Russian soldiers have taken to pleading on social media for more weapons, better equipment, and better tactics. Some Russian soldiers have begun openly questioning why they're being sent to attack positions they can never capture. Desertion and refusal to fight have become significant problems in the Russian military. Russian units that suffered heavy losses in Vovchansk were sometimes withdrawn from the line for several weeks just to rebuild their personnel strength. Russia's response has been to increase conscription. Russia has lowered recruitment standards. Russia has pulled contract soldiers from other regions. Russia has even brought in foreign fighters, including North Korean soldiers. In Kursk, North Korean troops suffered enormous casualties because they were trained in different tactics. They were not adapted to drone-centric battlefields. Ukrainian soldiers reported that North Korean assaults were often executed with human wave tactics. Hundreds of soldiers walking across open ground. This makes them ideal targets for drones. North Korean forces suffered thousands of casualties in a relatively short time in Kursk. This pattern is being repeated wherever Russia has deployed forces in recent months. The Vovchansk battle, from May 2024 to February 2026, represents the complete collapse of Russia's mechanized warfare doctrine. Russia entered the battle with massive numerical advantages. Russia had armor superiority. Russia had air superiority in certain sectors. Russia had artillery superiority. And despite all these advantages, Russia has failed to achieve any of its objectives. The city remains partially in Ukrainian hands. The buffer zone has not been established. The strategic goals have not been accomplished. Instead, Russia has suffered 15,000 casualties. Russia has lost thousands of tanks and armored vehicles. Russia has been forced to fundamentally restructure its military tactics. The lesson is stark. In modern warfare against a technologically superior enemy with drone dominance, traditional armor formations cannot succeed. Mechanized assault doctrine belongs to a previous era of warfare. Ukraine has essentially ended the era of tank-centric warfare through innovation and effective drone deployment. This is why Russia continues to struggle. This is why Russia must completely rethink its military strategy. And this is why Ukraine, despite being numerically inferior, has been able to contain and counter Russian offensives. If you want to understand the future of warfare, Vovchansk is where that future is being written. Russian soldiers sent on foot. Ukrainian drones dominating the sky. This is modern warfare. This is the future that Putin failed to anticipate. If you found this analysis important, please subscribe to Sophie Hart Reports for more deep dives into geopolitical conflicts. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Share this video with others who need to understand what's actually happening in Ukraine. And turn on notifications so you never miss our latest analysis.